Genres are a funny thing. If you're just going off of its dictionary definition, this is defined as a category of artistic compositions in music, literature, and all sorts of entertainment, characterized by similar forms, styles, and subject matters. And because we as humans just love dividing things into different groups and sectors, there will always be as many as the variety of stories on offer grows. Case in point from many of our previous discussions, the superhero movie. Yeah, I've tried to fight it for a number of years, but you can't deny that because there are similar tropes and trappings within these kind of stories, you know, ones featuring superheroes and all, then at what point can you just define it as a genre? And you could say that no, superheroes are a character archetype and not necessarily an entire genre unto themselves, right? And that was my argument for years. Because after all, some superhero films could also be construed as westerns, crime dramas, and even war movies. But you know, it's not unheard of for a story to encompass multiple genres, sharing key elements in order to create some kind of a fusion between the two. And moreover, there is a genre of storytelling where the key elements and even the name are all centered around a particular character archetype. That, of course, being the spy genre. You know, stories that feature espionage, intelligence operations.
Jesus Christ, that's Jason Bourne.
Maybe a few fun gadgets, high-stakes action, and of course, stopping some madman's threat to the world. Which, all of these are pretty transferable to the superhero genre as well, don't you think? Minus, you know, the capes and tights. Well, except for one story.
Before we get started, does anyone want to get out?
Alright, two, but we're not talking about the Winter Soldier today. Instead, I am alluding to Pixar's homage to Marvel's first family, that of course being The Incredibles. Yeah, I'm still on something of a Fantastic Four kick, so I figure let's talk about the first superhero family released to screen, and I mean theatrically, so that does not include Up, Up, and Away, and dive into a question that I've been mulling over for the better part of the last 2 decades since this thing came out. And that is The Incredibles a superhero movie? Or is it more accurate to call it a spy film? So let's discuss. Alright, I know what you're thinking. Pin Pop, you are off your rocker this time. How can you even put into question if The Incredibles is a superhero movie? Look, it says so on the back of the box. And yeah, there are the words, superhero, which, fun fact, used to be trademarked by Marvel and DC in a joint effort to keep all other companies from using the term, which is why so many movies use things like soups and capes and all those other nondescript terms. Luckily though, this expired in 2024, so I guess that's the end of that weird, non-definitional era. But if we can return to the back of the DVD case, while it says superhero at the top, I don't know, defying copyright laws or something, look at the bottom, where it is described as James Bond, Indiana Jones, and the X-Men all rolled into one. I mean, sure, it's Peter Taverns of Rolling Stones magazine saying that, not like a producer, but this is evidence that I'm not the only one who sees this comparison. Yeah, it is undeniable that this movie shares a lot in common with many of the super spies popular around the era. But before we start rolling through these points of comparison, let's explore why the Iron Giant director Brad Bird decided to take this route with his animated feature. Well, let's get the obvious stuff out of the way. In terms of what was going on around this time, the Justins were Timberlaking, Dragon Ball had yet to Z-Kai, and most importantly, the superhero genre had yet to really find its footing. And The Incredibles didn't even start production until April of 2002, meaning that there wasn't an entire cinematic universe of film adaptations that they could draw from. Up to that point, the only films featuring superheroes that really struck a chord with audiences was obviously the first Superman movie with Christopher Reeve, along with the second one to an extent, the Tim Burton Batman movies, the Adam West Batman TV series, a few cartoons here and there, and a couple Marvel movies finally breaking into the public consciousness. This being Blade, X-Men, and the first Spider-Man movie in mid-2002. And looking at this lineup, these movies take a vastly different approach to tackling their source material and bringing their larger-than-life characters to the big screen. Superman is the closest you can say to a template, in the sense of it sets up its character's origin, falls in revealing himself to the world, and confronting his first major supervillain. Meanwhile, Batman would continue to pick up in the middle of the Caped Crusaders adventures, and take a heavy focus on the villain's perspective, especially in the sequel Batman Returns. Obviously, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin are a bit confusing when it comes to how they structure themselves, mostly because they were kind of toy commercials first and foremost, with an admittedly unique art direction. Leaving Blade and X-Men to be furthest from the source material, using it for some references and character names, but overall going in their own direction with the story.
You're a dick.
Really the closest thing to a pure comic book to screen translation was with the first Spider-Man movie directed by Sam Raimi, where a lot of the elements adopted by the film were taken wholesale from the comics. But that Marvel method of storytelling pioneered in the first phase of the MCU, you know, we're introduced to our main character and the first third of the film be dedicated to endearing the audiences to them, because they're either snarky or wholesome, or generally just fun to be around.
Another!
And the remainder of the story would be them confronting some generic villain in order to facilitate a character arc that results in them becoming the hero that we would know them as for the next 10 years. And by putting this character at the center of an ever-expanding universe, this gives audiences something to latch onto as the stranger elements begin to unfold. And this is a template a lot of superhero movies, even beyond Marvel, follow to this day. But back in the early 2000s, they were still making it up as they went along. With very few successful comic book adaptations, they would need to find another source of inspiration to help them introduce these larger-than-life concepts to the big screen. And while I'm sure Brad Bird knows a thing or two about comic book history, probably being able to tell you things like the planet that Superman's from or the name of Batman's butler, he has admitted that he himself is not all that much of an avid comic book reader. Which is totally fine. You don't need to make liking movies and reading comic books your whole identity. You don't want to become me. But his general knowledge of the medium allowed him to identify the most recognizable elements and commit them to screen. So even though his story draws similarities to things like X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Watchmen, that's just because those things pop up all over comics, and not so much because he's referencing any particular run. And considering the fact that the Incredibles are all original characters, and the world they exist in is pretty much plucked straight from Brad Bird's imagination, it makes sense that he tried to keep things simple, and not go about reinventing the wheel when it comes to what is a superhero. So recognizable powers, bright and colorful costumes, secret identities, and wholesome good guys versus villainous bad ones.
The baby's sleeping.
Things you'll find in comic books and their big screen adaptations. All this work they put in makes the Incredibles easily definable as a superhero team at first glance. But back to the point that superhero tales were still trying to find their footing on the big screen, when it came to portraying these types of characters in movies, the ways in which you could go about telling a story with them were still up in the air. And considering the fact that not only was this an early superhero story, but also the first Pixar film to follow human characters, meant that the studio was dealing with a lot of unknown elements, and so in an attempt to garner some level of stability, position this tale in a much more familiar framework. This, of course, being the most popular genre of action features at the time, the spy movie. Yes, the sunglass-toting super spy has always been a household favorite amongst moviegoers, popularized by, of course, things like Mission Impossible and James Bond, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, it went into high gear with things like Spy Kids, Totally Spies, Codename Kids Next Door, Kim Possible, The X's, Charlie's Angels, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, getting to the point that it was being parodied in things like Austin Powers, Johnny English, and so many more. Yeah, spies were pretty much everywhere. And unlike the boring real-life ones fumbling their missions in broad daylight today, the early 2000s made them slick, stylish, and incredibly capable. So it makes sense that Pixar would pick up on this trend and do something similar with the spy archetype themselves. Their solution? Used as a framework for their superhero story. So how is this a spy movie? Well, there are a number of comparisons you can draw. Starting out with just the first scene with the Incredible Mobile. With the Incredimobile? I don't know. You think I do research for these things? It's all off the cuff.
It's the Incredibile.
Anyways, while Mr. Incredible's trusty chariot is similar to the Batmobile in many regards, such as the atomic turbine and the inbuilt computer, it's also similar to the Aston Martins that James Bond would drive in his original films. And I guess you could make the argument that Batman's always been kind of the James Bond of the superhero genre, but I mean, that makes sense why his stories always seem to stick with audiences worldwide. And I mean, hell, it'll eventually come full circle with the Bond franchise ripping off The Dark Knight. But back to the opening of The Incredibles, the story also begins with Mr. Incredible in a suit and bow tie, only for him to suit up in his Mr. Incredible uniform. Sort of symbolically telling us that this is a merger between the two genres, and not just one or the other. But this whole opening is mostly designed to establish that this is a superhero world, which is why you see Mr. Incredible doing things like catching muggers, getting cats out of trees, and even stopping a bank heist. Though I was surprised when I got older how in-your-face that dude's attempted suicide was, depicting the whole act in full, without beating around the bush or trying to bury the lead. Yeah, that was surprisingly grim for a kid's tale, especially one trying to mimic Golden Age superhero stories. But hey, it did its job in establishing that this is a darker Disney movie than what they normally offer. But after this opening, the movie would transition to the suburban life of the Parr family, who, you know, had to retire from the world of superheroing ever since they passed their universe's version of the Superhuman Registration Act. And these sort of attempts of the government trying to restrict superhuman activity is nothing new, appearing in things like Watchmen, the X-Men with the Mutant Registration Bill, and eventually would appear in Civil War a few years down the line. And it makes sense that Brad Bird would use these as a backdrop, considering the fact that these are some of the most popular comic book runs of all time. It's also perfect for positioning our protagonist Bob Parr, Mr. Incredible, into a place where he's experiencing something of a midlife crisis, leaving him vulnerable to those looking to exploit his desire to return to his glory days. And this is facilitated by a Mission Impossible style briefing delivered to him under mysterious means. And this message even comes complete with a self-destruct function at the end of the recording. and both the Mission Impossible and James Bond franchises would be a heavy point of inspiration for this movie. Starting with the man of the hour himself, Mr. Incredible, while he obviously fits into that generic superhero mold, a lot of his traits also transfer over to the protagonist of many of Spy features. With his suave, carefree demeanor, and ability to take a chaotic situation and make it all work out as though it was pre-planned, allows him to stand shoulder to shoulder with the greats like Bond, Ethan Hunt, Jason Bourne, Jack Reacher, name another white guy. Also, his powers are perfect for a character like this. Many super spies can be accused of accomplishing superhuman feats of strength and agility, but considering that these are all Bob's actual powers, that all actually just makes sense in the context of the story. They're also guilty of withstanding an impossible amount of damage, for no better reason other than plot armor. And the story solves this too by making the character Mr. Incredible just nigh invulnerable. And a secret ability that the movie doesn't explicitly tell you, but you can find out in the DVD extras, is that Bob also has a sixth sense for detecting danger, which is similar to a lot of super spies, who seemingly can tell exactly when an action scene is about to take place. His eventual aging out of the role makes him similar to another character in a famous spy story, that being Douglas Quaid from Total Recall, a story about a man who feels like there's something missing in his life, and is willing to allow a seedy corporation to mess with his brain in order to experience a few cheap thrills, which ends up unlocking hidden memories, where he discovers that in reality he is a super spy undercover, and needs to complete a mission where he ends up saving the world. Other similarities between Mr. Incredible and other super spies is the fact that he's a smooth ladies' man, managing to secure a relationship with the most sought-after woman in his field. All these elements make him a perfect stand-in for any generic spy hero, but by putting him past his prime, it feeds into both the movies and the creators' nostalgia for the films and stories that inspire them. Other similar elements of popular spy stories are the femme fatale in the character of Mirage, a QS gadget provider in the form of Edna Mode in her super suits,
No kicks!
a mysterious government agency supervising all their actions, an over-the-top villain from the hero's past with an army of henchmen and a buttload of money, an evil villainous based on a tropical island, which is apparently something that real-world supervillains do. But unlike that real-world villain who definitely wasn't taken out by the deep state, this one keeps a list. And that aforementioned list actually brings us to another point of comparison, that being the director's next cinematic outing. No, the one after Ratatouille. Hey look, Bon Voyage. No, I'm talking about his first live-action outing, that being his installment in the Mission Impossible franchise, Ghost Protocol. And many elements from The Incredibles would be carried over into his foray with the Impossible Mission Force. Like the list of superheroes that Syndrome is taking out with his robot is very similar to the opening where agents are being killed off by the mysterious villain. The story also follows a team of 4 led by an older hero from a bygone era being pulled out of retirement to continue the good fight in order to stop a maniacal villain from launching an attack from space onto a city below. I mean, it makes a lot of sense why Brad Bird we brought in the helmet installment in the Mission Impossible franchise, because he's already pretty much done it once with The Incredibles. I mean, it's a perfect fit, and is my personal favorite movie in the franchise. But now I want to go into why, even though this is still technically a superhero movie, I still think it's more appropriate to call it a spy film. Because while a lot of superhero movies share a lot in common with their spy counterparts, what I feel makes The Incredibles different is that unlike those related to the superhero genre, the spy elements, they are irreplaceable to the structure of the very film itself. Because think about it, if you were to strip away the superheroes, the costumes, the powers, you'd still be able to get away with telling a very similar story. That of a man down on his luck, who used to be the top of his field but is forced to retire to please the powers that be, and then years later after he started a family, all of whom exhibit exceptional prowess, the aging spy is brought back for one last assignment, only for the people to bring him in on said last assignment to betray him, and now he needs the help of his family to get him out of this bind as well as do their part to save the world. I mean, if you don't believe me, the story already kind of exists. It's called Spy Kids. And while you can take away all the superhero elements, the same can't be said for the spy ones. You need the private island, or at least some kind of a remote getaway to keep Bob separated from his family. You need the sneaking around to press the narrative that he's not letting the people who love him the most in. And yeah, while the opening of the film and the very ending where they save the city draw heavily from superhero iconography, basically the entire middle, starting to the point where we jump to the modern day, is that aforementioned spy story. I mean, Helen herself kind of alludes to this not being a conventional superhero story when she tells her kids in the cave how dangerous the stakes are.
Remember the bad guys on those shows you used to watch on Saturday mornings? Well, these guys are not like those guys. They will kill you if they get the chance.
This scene alone really alludes to that this is not your typical superhero setup. In fact, the superheroes themselves are not all that relevant to the story at this point. Watch back over the original Incredibles, and you'll see just how little the superheroes even need to be costume crusaders at all. All the ones that were knocked off of Syndrome's list, once again, as I said, could have been replaced with other spies. Their actual impact on the community as superheroes is not all that present in the story. There's very little that necessitates them actually being superheroes. Like, look what happens when they're asked to go into hiding. It seems like the world just completely moves on from them, as though they never existed in the first place. No one talks about how crime rates are up or supervillains are running amok. No one's inspired to carry on the fight, even if it's against the law. Bob and Lucius do what they can listening to the police scanner, but it feels less like they believe they have a moral obligation to use their powers to save lives, which is, pretty much the core belief of all superheroes, and more so they just have a desire to relive the glory days. But with the absence of the superheroes, it does feel like the world just kinda keeps spinning on as normal. And if you're asking about villains like Syndrome and how they play in, to be honest, Syndrome is barely a supervillain himself. He's more just a rich, egotistical narcissist dressing up as a villain. And don't get me wrong, this is no mistake, but rather done by design. All those heroes he's killed is motivated by a personal vendetta, and not so much a principled opposition to what they stand for. Nor is there any evidence that they stood in the way of his evil machinations. No, I'm not really sure they could if they wanted to. Heroes in this world seem pretty weak. Half of them got taken out by their own damn capes. But hell, even Syndrome himself points out that he has no greater ambitions than living out his own personal power fantasy.
And when I'm old and I've had my fun, I'll sell my inventions so that everyone can be superheroes. And when everyone's super, no one will be.
People like to focus on that last part, when everyone is super, no one will be. But I think the line right before that speaks more to his intentions. When he's old and had his fun. Because, in his mind, this is more just a game. Fun ways to spend his time, and not like a mission to bring about a new world order. All that's just kind of an afterthought. This is just the hyperfixation he got saddled with. Some boys get trains, dinosaurs, his was superheroes. And look, I get it. But the fancy costumes and high-tech gadgets aren't essential to his character, and you could have replaced his fixation with pretty much anything, and the story would have continued the same way, just with a different coat of paint. Imagine the people that work with him and buy his equipment are just putting up with his eccentricities because, the product's good and the money keeps flowing. But when you compare this to other more conventional superhero stories, Superman, Batman, Blade, X-Men, Spider-Man, these stories more deal with the powers and advantages that our protagonists are wielding and how they intend to use them to save the world, or at least their corner of it, as well as the personal costs that come with such an undertaking. But The Incredibles isn't about that. And don't get me wrong, the fact that this isn't really a superhero movie isn't a bad thing. It just helps us better determine what the film is setting out to accomplish, allowing us to judge it on those merits. And in that regard, to no one's surprise, it exceeds tremendously on what it sets out to do. And that is to tell a personal story with the setup of a spy film and the backdrop of a superhero one. Mr. Incredible isn't trying to change the world. Yeah, he has things he wants to be different, but that's not why he's embarking on the mission. He's trying to find his place within it. He generally cares about people, which is why he works as an action hero protagonist, but he doesn't give speeches to how those with power should extend the hand to those without, because in the context of this story, that's just not what's at the front of his mind. The sequel would tackle this, though not as successfully I feel the first one tackled its themes, but that's neither here nor there. As we wrap things up, I think I made it clear that The Incredibles takes more from the spy genre than it does the superhero one. Even the music harkens back to the 60s spy movie era, with a bunch of brass and horn instruments, creating an orchestra of mystery and intrigue, resulting in what many consider to be one of Michael Giacchino's best compositions. The fact remains that by merging these two genres, even though the spy elements are more crucial than the superhero elements when it comes to the story they're telling, I do think both are better together than had they gone with one or the other. And regardless of what I think, it seems to have paid off in the long run, because The Incredibles ended up grossing $70.5 million on its opening weekend, and coming out to $631.7 million worldwide. It's also still to this day one of the most beloved Pixar films ever released, garnering a legacy that would eventually even result in a sequel, though that's a discussion for its own day. But in regards to the first Incredibles movie, there is no doubt in my mind that it is more so a spy movie than it is a superhero one.
Where's my super suit?
But that's not to discount how impressive it is, that while juggling two larger-than-life story conceits, the creative folks at Pixar managed to find the human element within the high-flying antics and world-ending stakes. The story of a man trying to find his place in the world even when he feels that his best years are behind him, learning to embrace the love of his family, and share with them the things that are most important to him. It's honestly amazing how many different elements the story can balance, dare I say, incredible. And the results speak for themselves. One of, if not the most iconic film in Pixar's catalog. Though it doesn't hold a candle to Monsters University.